Test, test. 1, 2. No, it's okay. Jake said that he was going to record it anyway, so yeah. And I just kind of passed the folders out sporadically, but.
If I can impose, when you have a chance, come on up here closer, so that Jake, can you believe that? So that Jake doesn't have to yell at us. We have invited Jake Wilson from the Texas Presbyterian Foundation to speak about the options that TPS has to facilitate our brand new legacy fund. And so we're going to record this to make this available for others. I imagine that the threat of severe weather has kept some people from venturing out this evening, although it does not look so threatening outside. Don't look outside right now to verify what I've just said. Just wait on it. At any rate, we're grateful that you've come tonight, and I'm going to go ahead and hand that over to you.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it. And thank you all for being so hospitable and welcoming here to Trinity Presbyterian Church. As Jake said, my name is also Jake. I'm a lifelong Presbyterian. I grew up involved in the Presbyterian Church. I went to Austin College up in Sherman, which is a little Presbyterian school. Go Roos. And Austin College happens to have funds invested at this organization called Texas Presbyterian Foundation. And so when they were needing to bring on a new staff member, they reached out to the college, and I was that lucky guy, and I got to use my business degree and my passion for the church, and it's been a wonderful 8 years at TPF so far, and so happy to be here. As Jake said, today I'm going to talk about legacy planning and some of the maybe useful nuggets that you can use to apply to your own life, but then also to perhaps benefit the church in the future. So before I get too much further, I would like to say a quick prayer. If you'll bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and all of our many blessings. We thank you for the wonderful food. We thank you for the church and the wonderful things that this church does for the community and beyond. We ask that you be with us in our conversation today, and that you help us remember that we each leave a legacy here on earth, and we ask that you help us make that legacy be something that is pleasing in your eyes. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So, I'm going to open up with a little bit of scripture, Matthew 6:19 through 21. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So I think that these are nice words to kind of have echoing in our minds as we begin thinking about what our legacies are. Because whether intentional or unintentional, we each do leave some sort of legacy while we are here on earth. We're leaving our fingerprints and impressions upon everyone that we come across, whether it's our children at school and their friends, whether it's us in our work days, in our offices, or wherever we work, whether it's our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. We all impact those that we interact with. And when we're no longer here, we are going to be remembered. So I think that it's crucial that while we have the opportunity, we be very intentional about what we want our legacy to be. How do we want to be remembered? I want today's conversation to be dynamic and engaging, so don't hesitate to raise your hand, to pose a question, or to make a comment. So there will be time for Q&A at the end, but I encourage questions throughout. So while we're sort of mulling over that thought of what we want our legacy to be and how do we want to be remembered, I think that these questions right here on the screen are, kind of a good way to start, because obviously I think that we all want to be remembered in a positive light, but if we're trying to get a little bit more concrete about that legacy, I think some of these questions help us wrap our minds around what that is, because it's not always as easy as you might assume. So the first question, it's pretty broad. What would a better world look like for you? So visualize that. Is that a world with no hunger, or a world with less homeless? Thinking about what's going on in Ukraine, is a global peace, and everyone getting along. Perhaps you're very passionate about nature, and so you want there to be a very healthy world. Perhaps you're very involved in your community here in Flower Mound or the surrounding areas, and you want this to be a vibrant, great community that does a lot of discipleship. So think about what a better world would look like to you. After you've kind of thought about that, the next question I want to ask is, if all of your needs were met for the rest of your life, as well as your family's, and you had an abundance of money in the bank, what would you do with it? So assuming everything was taken care of, you didn't have to worry about money, but you had a lot of it. What would you do with those funds? How much of those funds, and let's say that there is somewhat of a finite amount, how much of your leftover funds do you leave to your family? How much is too much? How much is not enough? We all have different circumstances, different familial circumstances, and sometimes we need to leave more to our family, and sometimes we don't need to leave much at all. Some of us don't have a lot of extended family or children. I've had conversations with individuals that said, I saved a lot, I've got a lot in retirement, my estate's pretty large, and I had the conversation with my grown children recently about, what do you think an appropriate amount is? And the children, they've got great jobs and they're well off, and they said, hey, Mom, Dad, we don't need anything. And in some cases, it's the children are better off in helping the parents in later stages. So at that point, you start to think about, okay, well, what do I do with these funds? What do I do with my estate? And I think that one of those things is people kind of have that aha moment when they think about what they were passionate about, where they're involved. They think about their church and say, that could kind of be my kid. That's where I can leave, a legacy gift. That's where I can put some of my estate. And then the final question that I want you to consider is, where do you enjoy spending your time and energy? So think about that as well. You're all here on a Wednesday evening, so clearly church is something that is important to you. But where else? Where in your daily lives? Perhaps you love spending time outdoors, you have a garden, or you love to go fishing. Perhaps you love music, and music really speaks to you. Perhaps you're an educator and you're passionate about, helping people learn. So think about where you enjoy spending your time and energy. The other big question that needs to be asked that is oftentimes overlooked is the timing. So if we're able to kind of wrap our minds around, what it is we want our legacy to be, what we want to support, what we're passionate about, we also need to think about the timing of that and when it is most appropriate to make some sort of a legacy gift to that cause. Is it now? Is it appropriate to make some sort of a contribution to a cause or the church today so that you can see the tangible difference that your gift has made, so you can really see that gift go into action? That's really rewarding for a lot of people. But sometimes we need to say, hold on, I need to make sure that I'm taken care of and that my family is taken care of. Let me hold off on this. I do want to make a gift, but I truly want that to be a legacy in the future. So maybe it's after I've passed and I make sure that all my affairs are in order. Or even later, further down the road, making sure that my children are also taken care of. So it's important to think about the timing of a legacy gift as well. So once we have, sort of a framework, and I don't expect anyone here to have answered any of these questions, but I do hope you go home and think about this. There are various plan giving tools, different instruments that can help you accomplish that. If you do want to leave a legacy gift to support your church or other cause that's passionate to you. And these are just a few. I'm gonna talk through these tools right here and how they work. Obviously, this isn't the end-all be-all list of ways to give or make a legacy gift, but these are at least a few that I know about because TPF, we administer these, and so I'm going to speak to these. I want you to raise your hand if you've heard of any of these, okay? A donor advised fund. Okay, I see Jake put his fingers up, so that one person at least. An endowment. And you don't have to know the details of how these work, just if you've heard the term. And I feel like most people have heard of an endowment. A bequest. Okay, most people have heard of the term bequest. A charitable gift annuity. Okay, 2 people. What about a charitable trust? Okay, a lot of people have heard of a trust. Okay, so we're going to work through each of these, and as I'd mentioned, please don't hesitate to wave your hand and stop me if you have a question. I set out on the chairs these folders, so does anybody need a folder? Does everybody have one? So, if in this folder, and I've got a few brochures in here, I've got some information about endowments, an estate planning checklist, bequest language, things like that. But what I want you to pull out right now is this orange kind of trifold pamphlet. And if you open it up, it talks about different plan giving vehicles. And the first one that we're going to talk about is donor advised funds. And if you're following along in this kind of trifold thing, it's the one on the far left with the dark blue box on it. So there's some supplementary information in there if you want to follow along in there. What a donor advised fund is it provides you with the highest level of flexibility in a planned gift because you make an initial contribution to a charitable vehicle administrator, and in this case, if it was TPF, the Texas Presbyterian Foundation. By the way, who here is familiar with TPF or Texas Presbyterian Foundation? So a couple of people. Well, just to highlight this real quick, the Texas Presbyterian Foundation, we're a 501c3 organization. We were established in 1925 in what was at the time the Synod of Texas, working with Presbyterian institutions and churches that thought if we pooled our funds together, we would be able to achieve more with our own endowment funds. And so over the past 97 years of our existence, we've expanded and grown, and we've began managing funds for over 500 Christ-centered charitable entities. Most of those are churches across 30 states and counting. So we've kind of grown out to be basically a mission organization, and our goal is to grow more dollars to support the mission of our partners. So that's basically who we are. And we have a office that we're based out of just over in Las Colinas, so right down the road from here. And we have a partnership going back a few years with Trinity Presbyterian Church of Flower Mound in managing an investment fund that will ideally grow to be able to support ongoing mission and ministry in this church for generations to come. So that's kind of like why I'm here today, is to talk about how we can supplement that fund and how you may be inspired to contribute to that fund. So that is kind of TPF in a nutshell. And in addition to the investment management of endowment funds, we also offer these, plan giving vehicle administration. So the donor advised fund, you give a contribution to the charitable administrator, so TPF in this case, and you get the immediate tax benefit that year. You can write that off on your taxes during the year that you make the contribution to the donor advised fund. But just because you get the tax write-off that year, you may not have decided yet to which charitable entity you want to donate to, or when you want the donation to happen, or how much you want it to be. So let's say you do know you want to give some funds to Trinity Presbyterian Church, but you're not quite sure when yet. So you set the fund up in 2022. You get to write that off on your taxes when you do your taxes. But then in 2023, is when you decide, you know what, okay, out of my donor advised fund that I set up for $5,000, I want $500 to go to Trinity Presbyterian Church. And I also want $500 to go to the food bank. And then also let's go ahead and send a couple $100s to my alma mater. So you're able to choose when and how much and the frequency of when gifts are made out of your donor advised fund. And that's basically what you become. You are the donor and you become the advisor on that fund. The fund is held in trust at TPF, and you basically just submit instructions to say, please cut a check out of my fund to this qualified 501c3 organization. That's how it works. And the beauty of donor advised funds is that it basically functions as like a private foundation or a family foundation. A lot of people think about, if I was a multimillionaire, I would set up a family foundation and I could, make grants and give distributions to these different charities. Well, there's a lot of bureaucracy and red tape and requirements that are associated with having a private foundation. Basically, a donor advised fund is a very low-cost, simple way of having all the fun parts of a family foundation without all the red tape. So that's basically what a donor advised fund is. And to set up a donor advised fund at TPF, if you look at this little matrix here on this page of the trifold, you can see some additional information. You can see that the minimum to set one up at TPF is $1,000. No cost to initiate it, $1,000 to establish one. So it's pretty simple vehicle to set up. And you can always add more funds to a donor advised fund. I was having a conversation with a woman that lives in Central Texas, a few weeks ago, and she had the idea to set up a donor advised fund in honor of her late husband. So she named it after him, Memorial Fund. And every year she has a luncheon or a dinner, a little bit like what we had here, and it's basically a fundraiser, and people contribute, and she's going to take the funds that were gathered there in memory of her husband, and she's going to put that into her donor advised fund that she set up. And people can also just write one-off checks and contribute to her donor advised fund. And she and her children make advisory instructions to TPF to say, please distribute a check for this dollar amount to support this charity that my husband was passionate about. Or, it's just a really beautiful tool. And I think it really models generosity across generations, because one day you can pass those advisory roles off to your children. You're modeling generosity, but then they can also grow into that one day. So that's kind of the shorthand version of a donor advised fund. Are there any questions on DAFs before we move on? Okay. The next tool we're going to talk about is the endowment. And most of the hands went up. I think most people have heard of the term endowment. These are carefully stewarded and professionally managed funds. They can remain in perpetuity. They don't have to, and I'll give an example about that in a moment. And it leaves a lasting legacy of giving created for generations to come. If we're following along in the trifold, it's the far right with the little red square. You can see some details on how an endowment is established and how it works. So generally speaking, endowment funds are something that lasts into perpetuity, where you set it up for a certain dollar amount and you have a prudent spend rate. Typically 4 to 5% is standard for most institutions and churches. It enables it to distribute the income to help fund the budget or mission expenditures, while also gradually growing the principal ahead of inflation so that it lasts forever and ever, and it spits off money continuing to support the ongoing activities. That's generally how endowments work. That's not how they always work. Sometimes an individual can set up an endowment to last for a particular set number of years. So here's an example of that. Anita Bowman, and I know it's hard for you to read here, so I'll just read it for you. Anita Bowman, she's a 71-year-old widow. She's a busy grandmother, and she's an active member at First Presbyterian Church, involved in many ministries in the church, especially music. She's currently, for several years, been making an annual pledge to the church of $6,000. Anita wants the ministry of First Presbyterian Church to continue and knows that her annual contribution will be missed when she passes away. So she decides to set up an endowment with TPF to continue her pledge for 5 years after her death. So basically endowing her pledge for a set number of years. So she donates $30,000 to TPF to manage that fund, and TPF agrees to send annual payments to the church of $6,000 for 4 years, as well as a lump sum payment of $6,000 plus all of the growth from the investment on that 5th year. So that 5th and final payment will be greater than $6,000. And she does this because she believes that the church must continue to seek new disciples who will be generous with their discipleship, but knows that it may take some time for those new members to grow into that same level of generosity. She does not want to fund the annual budget in perpetuity, but she wants to provide a cushion for the coming years. I think a lot of churches are familiar with that concept that, there's folks that have been there and they're pretty frequent givers and pretty vital to the church's budget and to the mission. And when those individuals pass away, those regular recurring gifts are missed, So this is a type of vehicle that would allow an individual to say, you know what, I'm going to endow my pledge for a little bit, and I'm going to let other people step up to the plate and grow into that same level of generosity. Now, if you were curious, if she were to set up an endowment with the hopes of generating the revenue to fund the pledge for perpetuity, she would need to establish an endowment with $150,000 with a 4% spend rate. She does not feel comfortable with this. For whatever reason, she's not able to afford this. She doesn't want to leave $150,000 to set up an endowment, but $30,000 is doable. Not that there's anything wrong. Yeah. Not that there's anything wrong of establishing a fund like that, but even if it was, less than $6,000, maybe, you wanted to make an annual pledge of $1,000 or even just $500. Obviously, the required amount for an endowment in perpetuity would be a lot smaller. So it's doable either way. Any questions on endowments? The other brochure that you see in your folder, this Generosity Endowment, this talks about other stories of what other individuals have done in establishing endowments to support their church or the other charitable entity that they care about. So feel free to read through those stories. It might be inspiring. The next vehicle I'm going to talk about now is the Bequest. Bequest is not in this trifold, so you're not going to find it in there. It's pretty straightforward. The image here is a message in a bottle because that's exactly what it is. It is something that you leave in your will for the beneficiary to find later. So that is basically saying that upon my passing, I'm going to leave this set dollar amount or set percentage of my estate to the church. And that, that's essentially how it functions. It's amendable. You can have contingency information in there to say, should this organization cease to exist, I would like the funds to then go to the various missions or equivalent causes that it supported. Yes? Yeah, it's kind of like a time capsule. Yeah, it's kind of like a time capsule. So, it can be something that you make the church or a nonprofit organization aware of, or you don't have to. It can be a surprise. And it is amendable, like I said, so you can say, well, you know what, this nonprofit, upset me, so you're not getting it anymore. So it's not like it's set in stone. It's your will, but it is another way that you can leave a gift and kind of, establish that little time capsule, if you will, to support the church or other nonprofit. And in the folder, you'll see sample bequest language statements, and you can kind of use that if you're thinking about, I really need to sit down and establish a will if you haven't done it, or saying, I probably need to blow the dust off my will. There's some sample bequest language in there of, how to, include that, how you might write that out and then be legally acceptable. So, and I do want to preface this. This is not by any ways anything that I'm saying legal advice. I'm not a legal expert, but you should always consult with your attorney and also with any tax stuff like that, talk with like a licensed tax professional. So, were there any other questions about bequests before I move to the next vehicle? Okay. Charitable gift annuities. Now, this is one that I didn't see many hands go up, but that's a good thing because I think that you will all really like this vehicle. Now, the charitable gift annuity, you can find it in this second panel with kind of the brown colored square if you want to follow along within that trifold. So these are just a couple of characteristics of a charitable gift annuity. This won't make that much sense until I get to the next slide, so let me just go through this real quick. You receive a charitable tax deduction on a portion of the gift, and I'll explain why. You receive a portion of your distribution. You're going to receive a distribution back as tax-free income. It can reduce some of your capital gains taxes when funded with appreciated assets, and you're creating a future legacy gift to the charitable organization of your choice. So let's look at how this actually works. Okay, and I also have this diagram in your folder as well if this is too hard to see. So this is you, the congregation member. You make a one-time, irrevocable gift to the charitable administrator, in this case TPF. So you have a set dollar amount, say $5,000 or $10,000, that you put with the manager to invest and manage. It would go into our TPF balance fund, which is the exact same way that this church's fund is set up at TPF now. So the funds would go to the TPF balance fund, and then based on your age and life expectancy, you will get a fixed payment back from that fund on a regular basis for the remainder of your life, as well as the remainder of your spouse's life if you set it up to be a two-life charitable gift annuity. The older you are, obviously according to the actuarial tables, you're probably not going to live for as many years, and so your fixed payment back is going to be a greater percentage. If you were a younger person with, in all likelihood, more years left in your life, your fixed payment back will be a smaller percentage. It does not really make sense for someone that is below retirement age to participate in this type of vehicle because you won't be getting very much back. Now, TPF, with our fixed payments, we use the nationally accepted and broadly used rates that are published by the American Council on Gift Annuities, and they update those rates on a very regular basis. So if you were to sit down and go off of a rate and create an illustration and then revisit it a few months later, that illustration was probably wrong because the payment rates are updated a lot. But the flip side of what's so cool is that you receive all those payments until you pass away, and then upon your passing, the remainder of that fund that you establish then passes on to the church. So you set it up, get fixed payments back from that based on your life expectancy, and then the remainder passes to the church or other charitable entity. So let's look at this and apply some numbers to it. So this donor, Miss Donor, she is age 80, and based on her age, she's getting a 6.8% annuity. This is purely hypothetical because I promise you the 6.8 is not accurate today. This is a few years old. Yeah, so, but in this illustration, an 80-year-old was getting a 6.8% payout. So Miss Donor sets up a $10,000 gift annuity over into the charitable administrator, to TPF, and then she receives regular payments back for the remainder of her life of $680, 6.8% of that $10,000. So she can depend on getting $680 a year until she passes away. If she happens to really outlive her life expectancy and blow the actuarial tables out of the water, and let's say that the entirety of that $10,000 initial gift is depleted down to zero, well, TPF guarantees those fixed payments. So we would just keep paying the $680 for the remainder of your life, as well as your spouse's, if it's a two-life, if you designate it to be. The only downside is that there's nothing left over for the church or the charity, But hey, your generosity led to you living longer. So Ms. Donor receives those 680 payments back for the remainder of her life. A portion of that is seen as tax-free. The initial amount that she donated to the charitable organization is considered tax-free, and there's only taxes paid on the appreciated gains of while it's invested, and it would be invested in the TPF Balance Fund. Upon her passing, the remainder of that then passes to the church, or if you set up a CGA for another institution. And in this case, and this is based on what we've seen, about 70% of the initial gift is still there to pass on to the charity. So after this, not only did she receive back over the remainder of her life $8,568, but $7,000 then went to her church. So she turned that $10,000 into, over $15,000. If you take the $8,500 plus the $7,000, so over $15,000 is what she turned that initial gift into. And she received those payments back to help supplement her during retirement, and she left something, a legacy gift for the church. Now, you cannot add additional funds to a charitable gift annuity. Let's say you set up, the $10,000 CGA, and you want to, put more in there. Maybe you want a larger payout, or perhaps you want there to be more to go to the church. You can't add more money to it, but you can always establish another charitable gift annuity. And so that's typically what people do. They'll set one up, and then they'll set up a few, and maybe they're all to their church, or perhaps they have a different CGA for different charitable organizations. They've got one for their church, they've got one for the Presbyterian Children's Home, they got one for, they would love it that, the Peachaz would love it that I just said that, but you get it, their alma mater, or for this nonprofit organization. So typically what we see is when someone sets up a CGA, they usually set up a few more down the road. Minimum dollar amount to establish a CGA at TPF is $5,000, and it would be invested in our balance fund, as I mentioned. So, are there any questions about charitable gift annuities or how they work? Okay.
Explain to me why I would do that.
A charitable gift annuity?
Yeah, as opposed to, is there substantial tax benefit to it over another venue or means by which I might give a gift?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's not a substantial tax benefit as opposed to another one of the vehicles I talked about. The reason you may be particularly interested in this type of vehicle is because you would receive that supplementary stream of income. So you're saying, I want to establish this gift, and I'd like the fact that it's invested and it's not only kicking money back to me, but it's also invested in growing a little bit, and the remainder of that is going to go to the church. And so that's really, I think, the benefit. And I think that, as I mentioned before, this is probably more appealing to those that are retirement age or in the later stages of life. If you're a young person and you have, excess funds that you would like to give, then maybe a legacy gift such as an endowment or perhaps a donor advised fund might make a little bit more sense in your situation. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about a reason that I would choose this over a bequest, right? If I got to the end of my life and I was like, well, I guess, I'd like to give $100,000 to the church in my will, but I don't have that to part with. But maybe I can work something out like with this that would get me close to that.
Right.
And also sort of fund my final years.
Yeah. Yeah, with the bequest, you're not going to receive the tax benefit, because it's not made until after you passed. That would really be kind of that example of listing the church as one of your children. That's kind of what a bequest is, that, this child's going to get this much, this child's going to get this much, and this child named church is going to get this much. So that's a differentiating factor. Yeah. Other questions? Just to recap, this page right here is also in the trifold I provided you, just kind of talking about the cost to initiate. I didn't go into detail here on charitable trusts just because, as I said, I am not a tax attorney. I'm not, legal advice. And stage one to establishing a charitable trust, although TPF does administer them, would be going and talking to, your personal lawyer. And so there may be legal fees, applicable there. But for an endowment, charitable gift annuity, donor advised fund, there's no sort of cost to establish those. A minimum to set these gifts up, these vehicles up at TPF, $1,000 for a donor advised fund, $1,000 for an endowment fund. And again, those are two types of vehicles that are often seeds that you can add to or other people can add to. A charitable gift annuity, a $5,000 minimum, and then a charitable trust, $50,000, which it kind of sounds like a lot on paper compared to the other two, but it's actually significantly lower minimum as opposed to if you were to go out to kind of a for-profit entity that would administer those. So, as I'd mentioned, you cannot add any additional funds into a charitable gift annuity. It's a one-time irrevocable contribution of assets, but you can set up new charitable gift annuities. But you can add funds to the other vehicles. With the charitable gift annuity and endowment, at TPF we would put that into our balanced fund. It's just kind of a not too risky, not too conservative, but kind of a, kind of a broadly diversified way of investing that will, weather the storm, the craziness that the investment market is. But if you're setting up a donor advised fund or a charitable trust, you can select how you want your asset allocation to be. And then, there's no sort of income that comes back to you with a donor advised fund or endowment, but a charitable gift annuity does enable there to be a stream of income back. So with that, I'm going to pause for any last questions.
I'm just assuming that the seed money or whatever you fund your account with, aka the principal, the aim is not to touch the principal, correct, in all of these situations. However, if for some reason, God forbid, something should happen and I need to pull that money out, what happens?
You,
And I get it.
unless it is explicitly written in the governing documents that the principal may not be invaded, then yeah, you can. Obviously, when you set up an endowment, it happens pretty often. A church or some other nonprofit organization will set up an endowment fund at TPF with the hopes of that being there for decades and decades, but something happens. Something happens, and they've got to say, we don't like having to do this, but we're going to have to pull out of the principal. We're going to have to invade the corpus of the initial gift. And, the funds, the church's funds are the church's funds, and so they can do that. There's certainly no type of lockup at TPF. If an individual sets up an endowment fund at TPF, if an individual sets up an endowment fund and the church is the beneficiary of that, the church cannot impede the principal of that individual's, because that is considered separate. That is trusteed at Texas Presbyterian Foundation. We are locked into what the governing documents of what that individual wanted. Now, if they set it up to do that thing where it distributes the entirety over a set number of years, that's different, right? But if a church sets up an endowment fund at TPF from an organizational standpoint, like the investment fund, that fund that you all established at TPF in 2019, the church would have access to those funds should it need it. Say something, bad happened and you had to pull those funds. You could do it. Yeah, but when it comes to an individual, no. It's locked into what the donor explicitly stated. And so if you set up an endowment, we're going to go off of what's locked in there. I mean, from a fiduciary standpoint and a legal standpoint, we have to do that. So in a donor advised fund, if you set up, let's say you set up a $5,000 donor advised fund and you don't add anything to it, but you make distributions out of it, yeah, you could deplete it down to nothing. You could.
How much of this can be done online?
Well, We,
I'm assuming
well,
you want to meet with somebody.
you would,
Advisory capacity fund.
yes. So we have a person on our staff who it is, and her name is Jennifer Frano, and it is her sole role at TPF to set up and administer these plan giving vehicles. So she would be the point of contact, and you would reach out to me, which this is my contact information right here. Jake.wilson@tpf.org is my email address. You can reach out to me, or you can just call up our office and say that you would like to talk to me or Jennifer about setting up one of these vehicles, and we'll talk with you. And then we'd get the paperwork over to you and kind of fill it out and talk it over. With the charitable gift annuity, it's pretty cool though. On our website, tpf.org, you can kind of go down two paths. One is investment management for organizations, and then one is legacy solutions for individuals. If you follow the legacy solutions path, it will take you to a page that talks about all of those plan giving vehicles. But one of my favorite tools on that page is called the gift calculator. And if you click that, you can go in and run hypothetical gift annuity illustrations of saying, okay, this is my age, this is my tax information, this is, do I want to set up for a one life, or do I need to support my spouse as well? And I want to set up a CGA to support the church, but I don't know if I want it to be $10,000, $12,000, or $15,000. Well, you can plug in those different dollar amounts, and it will run the illustrations based off of the current gift annuity rates. The calculator does update automatically. We keep that up to date. And it will show you, okay, what would my fixed payment be on a regular basis? How much could I anticipate to get on a quarterly basis or an annual basis? And then how much is projected to be left for the church? So you can run those illustrations. You can sit down and do that at home, or with your family, or with your financial advisor. You can run those illustrations. It doesn't set anything into motion yet, but it kind of gives you an idea. You would then reach out to TPF, and then we would get the ball rolling and say, hi, I ran this illustration. This is what I want to do. And so you can do that. So, but again, I tell you this. If you run that illustration and print it off and it's sitting there, and then a year later you're like, okay, I'm ready to do this, remember those rates have updated. So keep that in mind. So, any other questions? Okay, well, I guess that concludes my presentation, and if other questions do arise, again, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Our website is tpf.org. Our phone number is there on the screen, 800-955-3155, or you can email me at jake.wilson@tpf.org. So, thank you all. Yeah.
For those who are unaware, we donated or invested, I think $100,000.
It was $100,000. Mm-hmm.
With TPF. It's in the balanced fund. It's currently at like $130,000.
Yeah, 133. Yeah.
Somewhere around there.
Mm-hmm.
So they're doing a good job with it. And our hope is that there are lots of good ways to support the ministry of Trinity Presbyterian Church through TPF. One of those ways is to give directly to the fund that we have with TPF. And you can do that, you could do it through a bequest, you could do it, but there are lots of ways you can do it. Right?
Any of these vehicles, you could designate that fund to be the beneficiary.
Right.
So
our hope is to be able to grow that so that can be an ongoing source of income for us to fund ministry here at Trinity, and that will look different every year, actually. So our plan is to take a peek at that and what we're going to be able to use from that every year, and to have specific things in mind, so it just doesn't go to keeping the lights on every year, right? That's not very sexy. That's important, but it's not very sexy.
Yeah.
So, but we will make sure that has designated fund access every year. So, anyway, that's the hope for years and years to come. So, thanks, Jake. Appreciate you.
certainly, it was a pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for tuning in and inviting me so graciously. So thank you.
Check, check. Hey, everybody.